The neuron story. What's all the excitement? I will use a network to describe this process. This network includes three cells: cell A, cell B, and cell C, along with two synapses. The first one lies between cell A terminal buttons and cell B dendrite aberration. The second lies between the terminal buttons of cell B and the dendrite aberration of cell C. The process begins when an event occurs in cell A such that neuron transmitters are released from the terminal buttons of cell A into the synapse between cell A and cell B. At this time, four events can occur. The first is the neuron transmitter molecule can dissipate into the interstitial fluid which lies outside of the cell. The neuron transmitter molecule may also be reuptook back into the terminal button of cell A to be recycled and used later. The neuron transmitter molecule may also be deactivated or degraded due to breakdown from enzymes that are in the interstitial fluid. The fourth way, and the way we are most interested in learning about, is when the neuron transmitter makes its way to the dendrite of cell B and binds to the ionotropic receptor that lies in the postsynaptic membrane of the dendrite of cell B. Here's a closer look at what exactly occurs. Cell A releases neuron transmitter molecules from its presynaptic membrane into the synapse. Once these neuron transmitter molecules are in the synapse, they make their way to the postsynaptic membrane of cell B, and they bind to the ionotropic receptors located within the postsynaptic membrane of cell B and open up channels. The postsynaptic membrane of cell B is a semi-permeable lipid bilayer membrane, which means it is selective as to what it allows to enter into the cell. If the ions cannot move freely through these lipid bilayers, they must take what is called an ion channel to enter into the cell. The ion channel is where the ionotropic receptor is located and the neuron transmitter molecule binds. Once this neurotransmitter molecule binds, it opens up the channel and allows for the ion to pass through the membrane and into the cell. This one is specific to sodium. Sodium is attracted to the inside of the cell for two main reasons. One is osmosis. Osmosis is when the sodium wants to work with its concentration gradient. The sodium is in a higher concentration on the outside of the cell and a lower concentration on the inside of the cell. Therefore, the sodium wants to move towards the lower concentration. The other reason is through electrostatic pressure. The sodium is positive charged and the inside of the cell is negative, which means the sodium is attracted to the inside of the cell due to it being positive, because opposites attract. We can see this by hooking an oscilloscope to the axon helix of the cell. The axon helix measures movement across the membrane, and here's what the chart may look like. When there's no movement, the cell is registering at a negative 70, which is the resting membrane potential. Once sodium begins to enter the cell starts to become depolarized, and EPSPs are formed. EPSPs are excitatory postsynaptic potentials. They register the depolarization of a cell due to the sodium being positive, and it starts to make the cell positive. Once you have a bunch of EPSPs, and it's called a summation, temporal or spatial summation, it brings the cell up to a reading of a negative 65, which is the threshold of excitation, and which is where the action potential is initiated. Once there is an abundance of potassium within the cell, the oscilloscope reading will rise up to a positive 55, which is where we have massive depolarization of the cell and where the voltage gates of sodium close and the ones for potassium open, allowing for potassium to enter back into the cell, trying to bring the cell back to the resting membrane potential. This section is called hyperpolarization. And it goes all the way down to a negative 75, where it kicks in the sodium-potassium pump to try to bring the cell back up to the resting membrane potential. Here is what the voltage gates look like that are opened when the action potential begins. The voltage gates look a lot like ion channels. The only difference is that they don't have the ionotropic receptors for the neuron transmitter molecules. Here is the threshold of excitation. The threshold of excitation is where you have a bunch of EPSPs and they travel through the soma and into the axon helix where they become summations. And these summations are what initiate the action potential. And this is what it looks like on a reading of the oscilloscope. You have a whole bunch of EPSPs and they lead up to a negative 65 and they cause an action potential. The action potential starts in the axon helix and they move from node of Ranvier to node of Ranvier, node from Ranvier, all the way to the terminal buttons. Once they get there, they release neurotransmitters into a synapse and the process begins again. The process of the movement of the action potential along the axon shaft is called saltatory conduction. And what occurs is as the action potential makes waves over the myelin sheath and hits a node, the action potential